Hello all. Apologies for the abrupt ending on the previous presentation talking about our summary for week 1. I was interrupted and wanted to take care of something. Now moving into our topic for week 2, we did touch on human behavior just a little bit last week when we were discussing some of the different topics like the intersections and the roundabouts and etc. The focus this week is at looking at human factors specifically, trying to understand what affects human behavior, and then looking at how we might influence or change that human behavior with respect to the decisions that are made in traffic safety and trying to prevent motor vehicle crashes and the injuries associated with them. Human factors is the applied scientific discipline to enhance relationships between people and devices and the devices and systems they utilize. It's focused on the user. The user is the focal point in the knowledge building, and we need to recognize the capabilities but also the limitations of those human beings in what we are discussing as the road safety or traffic safety system. Human factors is a complex mix of human behaviors, and it is, as we're looking at it, in an application of transportation. There are two different kind of influences or notions that come into human behavior. First is a deliberate system, and that's a conscious system, where a person considers information in a rational and logical thought process when they decide action, such as a local driver who knows maybe that they are doing some road construction on University Drive in Fargo and decided that as an alternative they'll go over and take an alternative street that, while it may not be their typical route, they can avoid that construction and the delays that are associated with it. So it's a large logical thought process, and you can the driver is weighing the positives and negatives of the choice, and in the end makes a decision to either 1, go on the construction route, or 2, chooses a different route where they think that they can certainly avoid that delay. The other part of the influence or notion in trying to understand human behavior is the intuitive system. It's an implicit unconscious process where, of course, we as people who make instantaneous decisions all day long, not as you know, you don't think about some of the things you do, it's just habit or instinct or how you have learned to behave. So it's where a person makes instantaneous decisions and takes the resulting action. For instance, you see a yellow light, that means you need to think about slowing down or stopping depending on where you're at, and you make that decision very quickly based on your previous experiences. That lends itself to us understanding some of the issues with people who don't maybe have previous experiences of stopping on yellow lights, or who just don't have any real experience built up yet, like novice teen drivers. So the intuitive actions, for the most part, it's just little day-to-day decisions, things we wouldn't have time or wouldn't want to have time to go into that additional processing of information that we would do for the more deliberate type of system or information processing decision type of system that is associated with a deliberate kind of decision. There's some examples, and they talked about at least 1 or 2 of these in the book, where there were, for many years or initially, people just really weren't interested in brushing their teeth. They didn't think that there was a real benefit to it, and even if they did, it was time consuming and just really took them away from what they wanted to do. So rather than push the teeth brushing as a whole or as an idea, the industry decided to offer mint flavored toothpaste, and it was actually that mint flavor that people, for the most part, or began to really decide that they enjoyed and liked, and it was more to get the toothpaste that they began brushing their teeth. And so that then started to build that intuitive action that they would just brush their teeth, again, because of the benefit or the fact that they liked that mint toothpaste flavor. I've heard similar, or I've read similar experiences related to the air fresheners. They think back 10 years ago or 20 years ago, no one went in and sprayed Febreze all over their room to get a good smelling room. So what advertisers, manufacturers have done, and this isn't necessarily a beneficial one, but again, a way with working with that intuitive part of human action, where they go into someone else's house and they smell how wonderful it smells, and they want that same type of environment at their own home, or the advertisements are showing how if you have a pet, for instance, that you are able to bring people into your home, and if that pet would normally have a lingering scent, you're able to not share that with your guests. So it's instinctual rather than a deliberate thought process to engage in those kind of decisions or actions. One of the challenges here, of course, is people don't necessarily share the same decision criteria. I'm sure all of us in this little TL 781 community probably have had very different or somewhat different cultural norms and prior experiences. Certainly emotion plays into it. There are also moral beliefs, there's social pressures, and then habits, and finally just things like financial considerations that would come into any individual's decision criteria and how they would come forth with what their action would be. And keep in mind that people also are heavily influenced by the environment and not always aware of it. Kind of, for instance, like the air freshener, where they're going into someone else's home, or they're seeing an advertisement and they just begin to accept that as the norm. They give an example in the book of the road diet, and keeping in mind, yes, humans respond to changes in their environment. There have been cases where the engineers, and I for those of you who are familiar with 12th Avenue North, you can see they've done some changes there, as well as the Main Avenue in West Fargo, where you're looking at how you're affecting the driver reaction to the road. Certainly if you widen roads and give wonderful shoulders for recovery and have great accessibility or controlled access with regard to those roads, drivers are going to perceive that they have a safe and dry environment to drive quite a bit faster than they would on something with a narrow, winding road where there's intersections or constantly traffic pulling onto that road. So there's been a strategy that has been been successful in several cases and is modeled. I know they've pulled that model in looking at 12th Avenue North, where they're looking at a road diet, where they provide an option for a turn lane or some type of kind of what we call a buffer zone on the roadway, but yet they are keeping the driving lanes relatively normal or narrow with regard to what people would perceive as safety and being able to drive at a speed that would be reasonable for that type of roadway, and the posted speed for that matter. You design not for how you want people to behave, how you want them to behave, for instance, widening of the roads, thinking they're just be safer that way, but how they'll actually behave, and that is saying that drivers will adapt to the driving environment. There's also physical as well as social organizational context, such as policies and norms that come into those environmental influences. So keep that in mind. And then finally, as we have all probably experienced, humans make mistakes. Deliberation, when it does occur, can certainly result, it may be the wrong decision or to someone else seem like the wrong decision. And or that intuitive process, certainly, again, those instantaneous decisions, we may not have the full knowledge we needed, or we may misinterpret something, or again, it may just be limited past exposure to that type of situation. But we do make mistakes on some of those roadways. We talked about roundabouts, for instance. How are people, if people have had experience on those, how they react to them. Perhaps some of the older drivers who are not quite as comfortable, spending a little more time on that roundabout, just making their way around until they feel comfortable getting off. But again, the goal of those roundabouts was to reduce the traffic conflicts and the severe injuries, which in most cases, it's been a very, very successful safety intervention or countermeasure where it's been, where they have been able to use it. Another idea or another example is posted speeds. There, what's typical is to look at an 85th percentile for the traveling, typical, or for the actual traffic in that route or on that route. So if you're getting above that 85th percentile, then perhaps you need to reconsider your speeds, posted speeds, or below that 85th percentile. Perhaps you need to reconsider your speeds or do something to operation-wise slow that traffic down if you have people going beyond what that would be. If you have it posted at a 45 and the 85th percentile shows 60, there's probably some issues, safety issues, engineering issues perhaps that need to be addressed to kind of get that driver back into making the right decision with regard to the posted speed. The human factors, and I think CJ maybe mentioned that these contribute significantly in traffic safety. Up to 90%, in some places that quote that over 90% of traffic crash factors can be attributed to a human factor role. This example that I found, they're attributing 95% of it to human factors. Again, this is a bit dated, but just trying to show you, we consider the road and environment factors, the vehicle factors, that's things like perhaps of getting a flat tire or having a breakdown or having some type of safety equipment failure on the vehicle is a relatively small portion of that. And then there's some that are kind of a shared element in what's happening with the road system, or they have all those factors that come into it. But what are some of those mistakes that we look at that might be attributed to deliberate or intuitive type of influence? No cruise control. I don't know if anyone else, I certainly have found myself when I've not been using my cruise control, maybe I've just come out of a zone where they're doing construction, or perhaps I'm driving in some pretty dense traffic and don't feel my cruise control is maybe going to be very useful, and I'm just going with the flow of traffic and look down and see, whoa, instead of being at 55 miles per hour, the posted speed, I'm at 70. I may be just going with the flow of traffic, but that would be intuitive, whereas when I look down, see I'm going 55 and look and see look down and see I'm going 70, and look up and see the posted speed is 55. If I decide to slow down there, that would be the type of decision that we're looking at. That's more that decided, going through a thought process type of deliberate decision. Taking cues from the environment, how might this affect speeding? Again, I mentioned the traffic around me was speeding, or perhaps you in North Dakota, as you may, for any of those of you who have driven off of some of the main routes, you can go miles without seeing another car. So when you don't have context for how fast you're going with regard to other traffic, that might be another influence in speeding. Something else that might be is, again, those posted speed limits, how frequently they are, where they are, if you're aware of them when you're going by them, for that matter. There may also be things with driver overcompensation. How might we maybe deal with this from infrastructure, behavior, environment type of idea? The driver overcompensation, looking at if he is going the road departure crash, which is huge as an issue in North Dakota, how, if he starts to go off the edge of the road, what might happen if the infrastructure, if they have a nice slope to the edge of the road or a forgiving, wide shoulder on the road versus a narrow shoulder, or if you're on a rural road, no shoulder. Also the behavior, is the driver wearing their seatbelt? Are they able to, have they had some experience or training to take control and bring that vehicle back onto the roadway? And we also mentioned the environment. What happens if that car does actually, or that driver does actually, the vehicle leaves the roadways? Are there things perhaps in the ditch or the median, depending on which direction that they're going, they're gonna cause harm, such as lighting poles or stop signs or other signs that may come in contact or be a point of contact for that vehicle. So in pointing out kind of some of those potential problems, we can understand what people or what safety stakeholders might be looking at to improve traffic safety. And again, that may come from a training of the driver, exposure for drivers in messaging through public information, looking at how they can improve the infrastructure to make it more forgiving. The other thing would be environment. Is there a way to perhaps move those light poles further out to give a little bit more time for recovery, things like that. It's resource dependent, of course, and it's usually some kind of a combined solution or combined set of countermeasures to see what is and isn't working moving forward. Speaking of the road departure or the run off the road crashes, some of those road departure strategies that I mentioned, the goal, of course, is prevention ultimately, but certainly to minimize those injuries. The education and enforcement components, those heavily rely on that, affecting that human behavior, that 90 to 95% aspect of what is happening there. Education, the public messages that come out, some of the social media messaging that comes out. There's also an enforcement component, and that may be just the general visibility type of enforcement that the police and law enforcement has when people see them driving, or perhaps giving the occasional ticket alongside of the road. Or it may be something where it's a very specific directed enforcement activity, such as red light running, like that we talked about with the assets that they have in Fargo or in the metropolitan planning organization areas, the MPOs. Engineering, some things that they look at there as countermeasures or ways to create a more forgiving roadway with regard to road departure strategies or countermeasures are widening those shoulders. It's kind of your recovery zone, shall we say. I know we talked a little bit about rumble strips, so we know if we're hitting the rumble strips, certainly we're on the shoulder, and if we have area to work with beyond that rumble strip, sometimes that is very beneficial, as we know in interstates, for instance, in making that safe recovery and pulling ourselves back into the flow of traffic. Reducing slopes, and that comes into play along with the roadside objects if there is a road departure. So if you reduce the slope or have a gradual slope, you're much less likely that's been shown to have a rollover type of event. And we know that the rollover events, when they do occur with the road departures, there's much greater likelihood for a serious or severe injury in that kind of event when it does occur with a road departure. Some of that also is impacted by, is that individual using a seatbelt? With the rollover crashes, ejection is a huge issue, and if that person remains, the article that was shared with the weekly discussion on the vehicle cage and the vehicle, keeping you in the vehicle because the vehicle is built to keep you safe. Well, that's true, but then we also need to make use of things like the seatbelt to ensure that we stay where we're supposed to stay within that vehicle. So important kind of factors that also come into that. Removing roadside objects we mentioned, and then the safety edge. That's a gradual slope, and I included a little summary of that off to the side. it's instead of dropping off when they, for instance, resurface a road, sometimes they'll add 2 inches or 3 inches to a road. So instead of having a straight 90-degree drop off at that edge, they'll slope it so it doesn't grab the tire and pull the vehicle if you do happen to make contact with it. So thinking kind of how would you use this? What is the best strategy? What comes into that decision? Who would be involved in making those decisions? How would resources best be used, and how would you perhaps work with a group of stakeholders in understanding what should and could be done? And then eventually, if you've tried something or you're trying multiple solutions, how could you use evaluation? What type of project could you put together that would help those, whether it be the decision makers at the policy level or at the engineering and within the engineering group, on the education side, or within enforcement? How could you help them understand how and if their contribution or their particular countermeasure is truly affecting that safety outcome for a more positive outcome? And then the next part, if one of you has an answer to this you probably can, it would be very, very successful. This is the age-old question: how do you change human behavior? And part of the key or the issue with this is humans individually have very different reactions to different types of influences. So when you are trying to change a behavior, it's good to understand the group you're looking at, the issue. Certainly lots of things we'll touch on. But for instance, have you ever made a New Year's resolution? We're all very ambitious on January 1st. We're big plans, we have a goal set, what we're going to do, and kind of depending on what it is and how much time it involves, have we truly changed our behavior by we'll say February 1st? And even if we're somewhat successful by February 1st, then it's more likely that maybe we're going to continue that at least through the spring and the summer, and it may become a behavior change that we've wanted and been able to achieve. But in anything that I've tried, and in most of my experiences with people I know, those New Year's resolutions are lucky to get past January 8th. So just kind of keeping that in mind, it's not a simple task. Distracted driving is a good example of a traffic safety issue where we're trying to understand how can we influence people in a way that, people live in social media today. That is just smartphones, tablets, etc. That is the way that people communicate these days, and often function, whether it's GPS, etc. How do we get an understanding of what will influence or incent people to drive safely behind the wheel and put their phone away, or if they can't put their phone away, if they're using it for GPS, to pull over and make sure that everything is set up that they need for their drive, and to set it on the voiceover so they are getting instructions and don't have to stop or glance over and look at the screen. All challenges, big challenges for the traffic safety world. So to change human behavior, we need to identify a target behavior and the influences and what influences it. So the influencing a behavior, like I said, we identified that target behavior, distracted driving, for instance. Why do people drive distracted? I know in North Dakota when people are driving, again, you may not see a vehicle for 15 miles, and it seems like a good use of your time to multitask on the phone, but that's also most likely those roads that are narrow and have little little access to emergency response if something does occur with regard to a crash. So what influences that behavior? Certainly, we've talked about some of those: peer influences, schedules, the environment, social norms, all those things come into it. So what are some of the weak links we could talk about if we're looking at how the causal chain, someone decides to drive distracted. What would be some of the weak links we can look at? The very first one to me would be taking that that phone or that device, phone most likely, into a vehicle in an active mode. There are ways to sleep the device or set up programs that'll let others know you're driving and that you'll get back to them when you've reached your destination. The next would be, of course, the education, specifically targeting probably those higher risk groups and understanding how you might be able to convince them, whether it's through peer influences, law enforcement, additional education, etc., to put that phone aside while they're driving. Some other examples would be seatbelt use, recycling, vaccinations. We're trying to understand, okay, what end result you want is that's 100% seatbelt use, or that recycling that's done on an ongoing basis, or responsible vaccination with both children and adults, just kind of the continued vaccinations that adults need to have, such as tetanus. So what are some of the causal, or the steps in that chain, and what may be some target for intervention? Strategies, the public information and education, changing that environment, like we talked about with the roadways. The other, something they could do with the smart vehicle, or with the vehicles, of course, is to have something set up that it automatically disables the cell phone. And I know, for instance, there are devices available for parents to get for teenage drivers, where it's not a choice for the teenage driver, it's a part of that environment when they get into the car, and that phone is automatically disabled when it comes into contact or when it enters the vehicle. So keeping in mind, human behavior is complex, and when you're working through the assignments this week and the readings, etc., just keep that in the back of your mind, also for kind of starting to think about what you might look at for your valuation proposal. I just wanted to finish up by touching base on the assignments for this week, and then what's upcoming in the next week. The readings and resources, of course, review prior to the discussion and unit activities. We'll have that weekly online discussion, and I look forward to seeing your posts on that. I've included a couple of links for some materials with regard to logic models for you to look at, and then also to complete an Environmental Protection Agency training regarding logic models, and just submit a short paragraph understanding maybe some of the knowledge you've gained and how that might help you when you start to think about your logic model for the proposal you'll be doing. The upcoming week we'll work into the Carter Unit 3 safety data, go through the logic model more in depth, start to talk about the North Dakota DOT Strategic Site Highway Safety Plan and how we might interact with them on that, work on those weekly discussions, and then complete the assignments. So as I said, I'm traveling next week, but feel free to send me an email or note if there are any issues that come up or questions. I appreciate, for instance, I got a note this week on that I had an incorrect due date, and I was able to go in and correct that. Makes it much easier for me to keep things looking as they should when I get a little feedback from you all on occasion. That's much appreciated. So just let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to visiting with you next week.